The letter that stopped the show. George Strait faces his greatest fear and discovers the power of a little fan. The sweat beaded on George Strait's forehead as he adjusted his black cowboy hat one final time, staring at his reflection in the dressing room mirror. The man looking back at him had weathered 43 years in the music business, but tonight felt different. Tonight carried the weight of something he had never truly faced before. The possibility that his legendary career might have ended before he was ready. 6 months ago, doctors had delivered news that shook him to his core. The irregular heartbeat, the dizzy spells during performances, the moments when his chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible hand. It all pointed to a condition that threatened not just his career but his life itself. The bypass surgery had been successful, but the recovery had been brutal. For a man who had never missed a show in 4 decades, being forced to cancel an entire tour leg felt like a death sentence. The Bridgestone Arena in Nashville buzzed with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the concrete walls. 20,000 fans had gathered, many having traveled hundreds of miles and paid premium prices for what the media was calling his triumphant return. George could hear the opening act finishing their set, the crowd's cheers growing louder with each song, building anticipation for the moment when the king of country would reclaim his throne. 5 minutes, Mr. Strait, called out Jenny, his longtime stage manager, her voice carrying the familiar mix of excitement and nervous energy that preceded every show. She had been with him since the early 80s, had seen him through his highest highs and lowest lows. But even she seemed different tonight. Everyone did. The stakes felt higher, the margin for error smaller. George's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his guitar, the same Martin D28 that had been his companion through countless performances. But before he could grasp it, there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he called, expecting to see Mike Garrison, his head of security, with the usual pre-show briefing. Instead, a young man named David stumbled through the door, his face pale and his hands shaking worse than George's had been moments before. David had been working as a production assistant for only 3 months, and his nervousness was immediately apparent. "Mr. Strait, sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but someone asked me to give this to you before you went on stage." He held out a white envelope, his voice barely above a whisper. George took the envelope, noting how David's hands were literally shaking. "Who gave this to you, son?" I'm not sure, sir. There was this kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and he was so insistent. He said it was really important that you got this before the show. He had tears in his eyes, Mr. Strait. I couldn't say no." The envelope felt heavier than it should have in George's hands. There was no return address, no indication of who had sent it. Just his name written in what appeared to be a child's handwriting across the front. George's instincts, honed by decades of dealing with overzealous fans and the occasional concerning correspondence, began to trigger warning bells in his mind. "Thank you, David. You can go now," George said, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. As the young man left, George turned the envelope over in his hands, studying it. The paper was slightly wrinkled, as if it had been held tightly by small, sweaty hands. He opened it carefully, and his blood turned to ice. The contents were unlike anything he had ever received. The paper was covered with dark, intense drawings that seemed to depict figures in conflict. At the center was what appeared to be a person on a stage, surrounded by menacing shapes and symbols that George couldn't immediately decipher. A cross. The top, in the same childish handwriting, were the words, "Tonight the real battle begins. The enemy is everywhere, but the hero must rise." George's heart began to race, not from the excitement of an upcoming performance, but from genuine fear. Below the drawings were more phrases that sent chills down his spine. "They want to destroy what is pure. To the stage is the battleground. Only the chosen one can save us all." For the first time in his legendary career, George Strait felt truly afraid. This wasn't just another overzealous fan letter or a request for an autograph. This felt like something far more sinister. The timing was particularly unsettling. His first show back after months of recovery, when he felt most vulnerable. "Mike!" George called out, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately brought his security chief running. Mike Garrison had been protecting George for over 15 years, a former federal agent whose instincts had kept them both out of trouble more times than either cared to count. Mike took one look at George's face and knew something was seriously wrong. "What is it, George?" George handed him the envelope and its contents without a word. Mike's expression darkened as he studied the drawings and read the cryptic messages. "When did you get this?" "Just now. A production assistant said a kid gave it to him, insisted it had to reach me before the show." Mike's training kicked in immediately. "We need to implement Security Protocol 3, now." Security Protocol 3 was something they had hoped never to use. A complete lockdown of the venue's backstage area, additional sweeps of the arena, and discreet positioning of extra security personnel throughout the crowd. It was designed for situations exactly like this, when a potential threat had been identified, but the show needed to continue. "Mike, I can't cancel this show," George said, reading his security chief's expression. "These people have been waiting 6 months for this. Some of them have traveled across the country." "George, we don't know what we're dealing with here. This could be—" "I know what it could be," George interrupted, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through his veins. "But I also know that I'm not going to let fear win. We'll take every precaution, but the show goes on." Mike nodded reluctantly. He had worked with George long enough to know that once the man made up his mind, there was no changing it. "Give me 10 minutes to get everyone in position. Don't go anywhere without me." As Mike rushed out of the room, George sank into his chair, the letter still clutched in his hands. He had faced down hostile crowds, technical disasters, and personal tragedies. But this was different. This felt personal in a way that cut deeper than anything he had experienced before. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent months fighting to get back to this moment, to stand on stage again and feel the connection with his audience that had sustained him for over 4 decades. Now, when he was finally here, someone, or something, was threatening to take it all away. Through the thin walls of his dressing room, George could hear the crowd growing restless. The opening act had finished, and the anticipation was building to a crescendo. In less than 15 minutes, he would need to walk out onto that stage and deliver the performance of his life, all while knowing that somewhere in that crowd of 20,000 people, someone might be waiting to turn his triumphant return into something far more sinister. George closed his eyes and tried to center himself the way he had learned to do during his recovery, but the images from the letter kept flashing through his mind. The dark figures, the ominous messages, the sense that someone out there viewed him not as an entertainer, but as a target. The sound of footsteps in the hallway brought him back to the present. Mike was returning, and with him would come the news of what they had found, or what they hadn't found. George stood up, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to face whatever came next. He had not survived 43 years in the music business by backing down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. But as he waited for Mike's return, one thought kept echoing in his mind. What if this time the fight was bigger than anything he had ever faced before? The door burst open and Mike strode in, his face grim but determined. Behind him followed 3 additional security personnel, their presence immediately filling the small dressing room with an air of professional tension. "We've got teams positioned throughout the venue," Mike reported, his voice low and controlled. "Extra agents in the crowd, backstage is locked down, and we're reviewing all security footage from the past 2 hours." George nodded, trying to push down the knot of anxiety that had settled in his stomach. "What about the kid who delivered this?" We're working on it. David gave us a description. Brown hair, about 8 years old, wearing a faded George Strait t-shirt. We're scanning the crowd now. Mike paused, studying George's face. You sure you want to do this? We can still call it off. Say you had a medical issue. Oh, the suggestion hit George like a physical blow. After everything he had been through, the surgery, the recovery, the months of uncertainty, the idea of backing down now felt like admitting defeat. No, he said firmly. These people came here to see a show, and that's what they're going to get. Mike's radio crackled to life. Base, this is Eagle Eye. We've got eyes on a possible match, section 104, row 10. Young male, matches the description, accompanied by 2 adults. George felt his pulse quicken. Is that him? Maybe, Mike replied, speaking into his radio. Do not approach yet. Keep visual contact and report any unusual behavior. He turned back to George. We need to be smart about this. If this kid is involved in something bigger, we don't want to spook whoever might be behind it. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. George tried to focus on his pre-show routine, vocal warm-ups, checking his guitar tuning, reviewing the set list, but his mind kept wandering to that letter and its disturbing contents. Every sound in the hallway made him jump. Every radio transmission from Mike's team sent his heart racing. George, Mike said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of surprise, you need to see this. On Mike's tablet was a freeze frame from the security cameras, showing a young boy with tousled brown hair and wearing what appeared to be a vintage George Strait tour shirt. The child was talking animatedly to David, the production assistant, his face bright with excitement rather than menace. His small hands were gesturing wildly, and even through the grainy security footage, it was clear that this was not the face of someone harboring dark intentions. That's him, George asked, studying the image. The boy looked so young, so innocent, so completely unlike what he had imagined after reading that letter. That's our suspect, Mike confirmed, though his tone suggested he was beginning to have doubts about the threat level. His name is Lucas Martinez. He's here with his parents, Roberto and Maria Martinez. They drove up from Murfreesboro specifically for tonight's show. George stared at the image, trying to reconcile the sweet-faced child on the screen with the dark, threatening drawings that had filled him with such dread. Have you talked to them? Not yet. We wanted to observe first, make sure we weren't walking into something bigger. Mike's radio crackled again. Base, this is Eagle Eye. The family appears to be completely normal. The kid keeps looking toward the stage, seems excited about the show. No signs of suspicious behavior. As if summoned by their conversation, Jenny appeared in the doorway, her clipboard in hand, and a look of barely controlled panic on her face. George, we need to make a decision. The crowd is getting restless, and we're already running 10 minutes behind schedule. If we don't start soon, we're going to have 20,000 very unhappy people on our hands. George looked at Mike, who was still studying the security feeds on his tablet. What's your professional assessment? Mike was quiet for a long moment, his years of experience weighing the evidence. Honestly, I think we might be dealing with a misunderstanding. The kid looks harmless, the family seems normal, and our teams haven't detected anything else suspicious. But George, I can't guarantee anything. That letter is still concerning. Show me the letter again, George said, reaching for the envelope he had set aside. As he studied the drawings once more, something began to shift in his perception. The dark figures he had initially seen as threatening now looked more like cartoon characters. The stage in the center of the drawing had details he hadn't noticed before, what appeared to be a cowboy hat, a guitar, and musical notes floating around the central figure. Mike, look at this, George said, pointing to specific elements in the drawing. What if these aren't threats? What if they're something else? Before Mike could respond, Jenny's voice cut through their conversation with increasing urgency. George, I hate to interrupt, but we really need to start the show. The crowd is starting to chant your name. Indeed, the sound of 20,000 voices calling, "George! George! George!" was beginning to penetrate the walls of the dressing room. It was a sound that had motivated him through countless performances, but tonight it added to the pressure building in his chest. George made a decision that would change everything. "Mike, I want to meet the kid." "What?" Mike looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "George, we don't know what we're dealing with here. Standard protocol is to keep potential threats away from the principal." "That's not a threat," George said, pointing to the image on Mike's tablet. "That's a little boy who's excited about a concert. And if I'm wrong, well, that's what you're here for." He stood up, adjusting his hat and reaching for his guitar. "But I'm not going on that stage until I know what this is really about." Mike's expression showed the internal struggle between his protective instincts and his respect for George's judgment. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, but we do this my way. Controlled environment, full security presence, and at the first sign of anything unusual, we shut it down." "Agreed," George said, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity. "But Mike, be gentle with them. If this is what I think it might be, that family is probably scared out of their minds right now." "Lady." As Mike spoke into his radio, coordinating the careful approach to the Martinez family, George found himself thinking about his own childhood, about the heroes he had looked up to, about the innocent enthusiasm that could sometimes be misinterpreted by adults who had forgotten what it felt like to see the world through a child's eyes. He had a feeling that the next few minutes would reveal a truth that would change not just the course of this evening, but his entire perspective on what it meant to be someone's hero. The crowd's chanting grew louder, more insistent, but George barely heard it now. His focus was entirely on the mystery that was about to unfold, and on the small boy whose simple act of fandom had nearly brought his career to a standstill. Whatever happened next, George knew that this night would be remembered not for the music he played, but for the lesson he was about to learn about the true power of innocence in a world that had taught him to see danger everywhere. 5 minutes later, George found himself in a small conference room beneath the arena, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and lingering concern. Mike had positioned 2 security guards at the door and kept his hand near his radio, ready to call for backup at a moment's notice. The room felt sterile and cold, nothing like the warm, inviting spaces where George typically met his fans. The door opened and Mike entered first, followed by a man and woman who looked to be in their late 30s. Roberto Martinez was a stocky man with calloused hands and worn jeans, clearly someone who worked with his hands for a living. His wife, Maria, was petite, with kind eyes that darted nervously around the room, her hand protectively resting on the shoulder of the small boy between them. Lucas Martinez was even smaller than he had appeared in the security footage. His brown hair was slightly messy, as if he had been running his hands through it with excitement, and his faded George Strait t-shirt was clearly a treasured possession that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that struck George immediately. They were wide with wonder and filled with tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. "Please, sit down," George said gently, gesturing to the chairs across from him. His voice carried none of the authority he used on stage, instead taking on the warm, fatherly tone he had perfected during his years of raising his own children. Roberto cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Strait, I want to apologize for whatever Lucas did. We don't know why security brought us here, but if he bothered you somehow—" "Dad, I didn't do anything bad," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to show him my drawing." George felt something shift in his chest. The fear that had gripped him for the past 30 minutes began to dissolve, replaced by a growing understanding of what had really happened. "Lucas, can you tell me about your drawing? The boy's eyes lit up despite his obvious nervousness. It's you as a superhero, like in my favorite cartoon, where the good guys fight the bad guys who want to ruin everything good in the world. His words tumbled out in a rush, as if he had been waiting years to share this story. You're Captain Country, and you fight against the pop villains who want to make all music sound the same. Maria placed a comforting hand on her son's back. Lucas has been working on that drawing for months. He's obsessed with superheroes, and he thinks you're the greatest hero in country music. George pulled out the letter, looking at it with completely new eyes. What he had interpreted as dark, threatening figures were actually Lucas's attempt to draw comic book villains, complete with exaggerated features and dramatic poses. The stage in the center wasn't a battleground, but a concert venue where the hero was performing. The musical notes he had missed in his initial panic were scattered throughout the drawing, showing a child's understanding of how music could be a force for good. Lucas, these words you wrote, "Tonight, the real battle begins." What did you mean by that? Lucas's face brightened with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. Well, in my cartoon, the heroes always have to prove themselves in the biggest battle. And tonight is your first show back after you were sick, so I thought it was like your biggest battle. You have to show everyone that you're still the strongest country hero. George felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. This child had understood something that even his closest advisors had missed, that tonight wasn't just another concert, but a moment when George was fighting to reclaim his identity as an artist and a performer. "And the enemy is everywhere?" George asked, reading another line from the letter. "That's about the pop music on the radio," Lucas explained earnestly. "My dad says real country music is getting harder to find, and that you're one of the last ones who still plays it the right way. So the pop villains are everywhere, trying to make country music sound like everything else." Roberto nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I might have gotten a little carried away, talking about how much I miss traditional country music. Lucas takes everything very seriously." George looked at the drawing again, seeing it through Lucas's eyes. The central figure, himself as Captain Country, stood tall and proud, holding a guitar like a weapon against forces that would compromise the integrity of the music he loved. It was crude and childish, but it was also profound in its simplicity. "Lucas, why was it so important that I get this before the show?" "Because heroes need to remember who they are before they fight," Lucas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "In my cartoon, Captain Country sometimes forgets how special he is, and he needs someone to remind him that people are counting on him to save the music." The room fell silent as the full impact of Lucas's words settled over everyone present. This 8-year-old boy had somehow understood that George was struggling with doubt and fear, and had tried to send him a message of encouragement in the only way he knew how. Mike, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "George, we need to get you to the stage. The crowd is getting restless." But George wasn't ready to leave yet. He knelt down in front of Lucas, bringing himself to the boys, eye level. "Lucas, can I ask you something? Are you brave?" Lucas considered this question very seriously. "I don't know. I get scared sometimes, like right now meeting you. But my mom says being brave means doing important things, even when you're scared." "Your mom is very wise," George said, glancing at Maria with respect. "Because that's exactly what being brave means. And you know what? You've helped me remember how to be brave tonight." "I did?" Lucas's eyes widened with wonder. "You did. You see, I was scared about tonight too. Scared that I might not be good enough anymore, scared that people might not want to hear my music. But you reminded me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight to protect the things we love." George stood up, making a decision that would change not just the course of the evening, but the trajectory of young Lucas's life. "Lucas, how would you like to help me fight those pop villains tonight?" The boy's mouth fell open in shock. "You mean on stage? In front of all those people?" "That's exactly what I mean," George said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Every superhero needs a sidekick, and I think Captain Country just found his." Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Roberto looked like he might faint. But Lucas looked like he had just been told he could fly. "But I don't know how to play guitar," Lucas said, his practical side warring with his excitement. "Don't worry about that," George said with a smile. "Superheroes have many different powers. Tonight, your power is going to be reminding everyone in that audience what real music is supposed to feel like." As George led the Martinez family toward the stage, he felt lighter than he had in months. The fear that had gripped him earlier had been replaced by something far more powerful. The reminder that his music had the ability to touch lives, to inspire dreams, and to create heroes out of ordinary people. The crowd's chanting reached a crescendo as they approached the stage entrance, but George no longer heard it as pressure. Instead, he heard it as 20,000 voices calling for their hero to rise up and fight the good fight. And tonight, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The backstage area buzzed with controlled chaos as news of George's decision spread through the crew. Jenny, his stage manager, looked like she was about to have a nervous breakdown. "George, we can't just put a random kid on stage. There are liability issues, insurance concerns, and we haven't rehearsed anything." "Sometimes the best moments happen when we stop rehearsing and start living," George replied, his hand resting protectively on Lucas's shoulder. The boy was trembling with excitement, his eyes wide as he took in the organized mayhem of a major concert production. Mike approached with a small wireless headset. "If we're doing this, we need to do it right. Lucas, this will help you hear Mr. Strait even with all the noise from the crowd." He knelt down to fit the earpiece, his gruff exterior softening as he worked with the child. "You just stay close to George and do exactly what he tells you, okay?" Lucas nodded solemnly, understanding the magnitude of what was happening. "Will my mom and dad be able to see me?" "They'll have the best seats in the house," George assured him. "Mike, can you make sure Roberto and Maria get moved to the VIP section?" "Already taken care of," Mike replied, speaking into his radio to coordinate the move. As the final preparations were made, George found himself looking at Lucas with newfound respect. The boy had somehow managed to see past the celebrity persona to the human being underneath, recognizing that even heroes needed encouragement. It was a level of emotional intelligence that many adults never achieved. "Lucas, are you ready for this?" George asked, adjusting his own microphone. "I think so," Lucas replied, his voice small but determined. "But what if I mess up? What if I forget what to do?" George smiled, remembering his own stage fright from decades past. "Let me tell you a secret. I've been doing this for over 40 years, and I still get nervous before every show. The trick isn't to stop being nervous. The trick is to remember that being nervous means you care about doing something important." The opening chords of the first song began to play, and George felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had sustained him through thousands of performances. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just performing for his fans, he was performing with one of them, and that made everything feel new again. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcer's voice over the sound system, "please welcome the king of country music, George Strait." The roar from the crowd was deafening as George stepped onto the stage, his guitar slung over his shoulder and his cowboy hat perfectly positioned. The lights hit him like a warm embrace, and for a moment all of his doubts and fears melted away. This was where he belonged, where he had always belonged, and where he would continue to belong for as long as his voice could carry a tune. He launched into Amarillo Morning, his voice strong and clear, the months of recovery and uncertainty falling away like an old coat he no longer needed. The crowd sang along with every word, their voices creating a wall of sound that seemed to lift him higher with each note. But throughout the song, George's eyes kept drifting to the side of the stage where Lucas stood watching, his face glowing with pure joy. The boy was singing along, his small voice lost in the vastness of the arena, but his enthusiasm unmistakable. After the third song, George stepped closer to the microphone stand, his expression growing more serious. "You know, tonight is a special night for me. It's my first time back on stage after some health challenges, and I'll be honest with you, I was nervous, real nervous." The crowd responded with supportive cheers, showing the kind of loyalty that had sustained George's career for decades. "But sometimes," George continued, "when we're feeling lost or scared, life sends us exactly what we need. Tonight, life sent me a reminder about why I do this, and I want to share that reminder with all of you." He gestured toward the wings, and Lucas stepped into view, his small frame dwarfed by the massive stage, but his presence somehow filling the space. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, a mixture of surprise, delight, and curiosity that rippled through the arena like a wave. "This is Lucas Martinez," George said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "He's 8 years old, he's from Murfreesboro, and he's got something to say about real country music." Lucas approached the microphone stand, which had to be lowered significantly to accommodate his height. His parents, now seated in the VIP section, looked like they were experiencing every emotion simultaneously: pride, terror, joy, and disbelief, all playing across their faces. "Hi," Lucas said into the microphone, his voice small but carrying throughout the arena. "My name is Lucas, and I drew a picture of Mr. Strait as a superhero because he fights to keep country music real." The crowd erupted in applause, and George could see several people in the front rows wiping away tears. There was something about the innocence and sincerity of the child that cut through all the artifice and pretense of modern entertainment. "Lucas believes that country music is in trouble," George continued, his arm around the boy's shoulders. "He thinks there are forces out there trying to make it sound like everything else, and he's probably right. But he also believes that as long as we remember what real country music feels like, we can fight to keep it alive." George strummed his guitar, the opening chords of "The Cowboy Rides Away" filling the arena. "Lucas, you want to help me with this one?" The boy nodded eagerly, and George guided him to stand directly in front of the microphone. "Just do what feels right," George whispered in his ear. As George began to sing, Lucas stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, absorbing every note. The song was one of George's most beloved, a melancholy ballad about the end of an era. But tonight it took on new meaning. Here was the old guard, represented by George, passing something precious to the next generation, embodied by Lucas. During the instrumental break, George did something he had never done in 40 years of performing. He held out his guitar to Lucas, positioning the boy's small fingers on the strings. "Just press down right here," he whispered, "and let the music happen." Lucas pressed his finger against the string, and George strummed a single clear note that rang out across the arena. The crowd's response was thunderous. 20,000 people recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "That's the sound of country music's future," George said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "As long as we have young people like Lucas, who understand what this music means, who believe in its power to tell real stories about real people, then country music will never die." He finished the song with Lucas still beside him, the boy's small hand resting on the guitar's neck. The applause seemed to go on forever, but George barely heard it. He was too busy watching Lucas's face, seeing the pure joy and wonder of a child who had just experienced something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the applause finally began to die down, George made another spontaneous decision. "Lucas, I want to make you a promise. That drawing you made of me as Captain Country, we're going to use it as the official poster for my next tour. Because you reminded me tonight that being a hero isn't about being perfect or fearless. It's about standing up for the things you believe in, even when you're scared." The crowd exploded in approval, and George could see tears streaming down. Maria's face in the VIP section. Roberto was standing, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt, his face beaming with pride. But the night's surprises weren't over yet. As George prepared to send Lucas back to his parents, the boy tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Strait, can I ask you something?" George knelt down so Lucas could whisper in his ear. Whatever the boy said made George's eyes widen with surprise and delight. He stood up, grinning at the crowd. "It seems our young hero has one more surprise for us tonight." Lucas stepped back to the microphone, his confidence growing with each moment on stage. "I've been taking guitar lessons for 2 years," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the arena. "And I learned one of your songs. Could I play a little bit of it for everyone?" The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. 20,000 people rose to their feet, their cheers creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the arena. George looked stunned, then delighted, then incredibly moved as he realized what was happening. "Well, I'll be," George said into his microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "Lucas, you've been holding out on me. What song did you learn?" "Heartland," Lucas replied, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "It's my favorite because it talks about keeping traditions alive, and that's what superheroes do." George's eyes misted over as he realized the profound appropriateness of the choice. Heartland was one of his most meaningful songs, a tribute to the values and traditions that had shaped American music. For this 8-year-old boy to choose it, to understand its deeper meaning, was almost too perfect to believe. "Well then," George said, signaling to his band to step back, "let's hear it." One of the roadies quickly brought out a smaller acoustic guitar, properly sized for a child. Lucas took it with reverence, his small hands positioning themselves on the neck with the careful precision of someone who had practiced countless hours. He looked out at the sea of faces, and for a moment, George saw a flicker of the fear that had gripped him earlier. "Hey, Lucas," George said softly, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember what your mom said about being brave?" Lucas nodded, taking a deep breath. "Being brave means doing important things even when you're scared." "That's right, and this is important. All these people are here because they love country music, just like you do. They're your friends, not strangers." With that encouragement, Lucas began to play. His small fingers moved across the strings with surprising confidence, and while his technique wasn't perfect, there was something pure and honest about the sound he produced. The arena fell completely silent, 20,000 people holding their breath as they witnessed something extraordinary. When Lucas began to sing, his young voice carrying the timeless words of Heartland across the arena, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. His voice was clear and true, lacking the polish of a professional performer, but possessing something far more valuable: absolute sincerity. "There's a home place under fire tonight in the Heartland," Lucas sang, his voice growing stronger with each line. "And the bankers are taking my home and my land from me." George joined in for the chorus, his deeper voice harmonizing with Lucas's pure tones, creating a blend that represented the past and future of country music coming together. In perfect harmony, the audience sang along softly, their voices creating a gentle backdrop that supported rather than overwhelmed the young performer. As the song concluded, the arena erupted in the longest, loudest standing ovation of George's career. People were crying, laughing, cheering, and celebrating all at once. In the VIP section, Roberto had his arm around Maria, both of them weeping with joy and pride. Throughout the crowd, parents were lifting their own children onto their shoulders, as if hoping some of Lucas's magic might transfer to their little ones. George wiped his eyes unashamedly, looking at Lucas with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "I've been in this business for over 40 years, and I can honestly say that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard." The crowd's response was deafening, but George raised his hand for quiet. "Lucas, you've given me and everyone here tonight something precious. You've reminded us that country music isn't just about the songs we sing. It's about the heart we put into those songs and the traditions we pass down to the next generation." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "Tonight, I was scared. Scared about whether I still belonged on this stage, scared about whether my voice still mattered. But you showed me that heroes aren't people who aren't afraid. Heroes are people who find the courage to stand up for what they believe in, even when they're trembling inside." George turned to Lucas, his voice carrying throughout the arena. "Lucas Martinez, you are the bravest person I've ever met, and I want to make you another promise, right here in front of all these witnesses." The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I'm going to start a scholarship program," George announced, his voice ringing with conviction. "The Lucas Martinez Foundation for Young Country Artists. We're going to help kids like you learn music, understand the traditions that make country music special, and find their own voices to carry those traditions forward." The crowd exploded in approval, but George wasn't finished. "And Lucas, I want you to be the first recipient. We're going to make sure you get the best music education possible, because I have a feeling that someday you're going to be standing on a stage like this, inspiring some other scared performer to remember why they fell in love with music in the first place." Lucas looked stunned, his small face struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it," George said firmly. "But first, we have to finish this show. Think you can help me with a few more songs?" What followed was the most magical hour of George's career. Lucas remained on stage for the entire rest of the show, sometimes playing along on his small guitar, sometimes just standing beside George and soaking up the experience. The crowd sang louder than George had ever heard, as if they understood. They were witnessing something historic. During All My Exes Live in Texas, Lucas provided enthusiastic backup vocals that had the entire arena laughing with delight. When George played Amarillo Morning, Lucas swayed to the music with such pure joy that several news cameras focused on him exclusively. And when they closed with The Chair, Lucas harmonized on the chorus with a confidence that suggested he had been performing with George for years rather than hours. As the final notes faded and the crowd began their thunderous appreciation, George looked down at Lucas and saw his own younger self, full of dreams, passion, and an unshakable belief in the power of music to change lives. The boy who had terrified him with a simple drawing had become the person who reminded him why he had chosen this life in the first place. "Thank you, Nashville," George called out to the crowd. "Thank you for accepting us both tonight, and for reminding me that country music's future is in good hands." As they walked off stage together, Lucas looked up at George with shining eyes. "Mr. Strait, do you think I really could be a country singer someday?" George stopped walking and knelt down to Lucas's level one more time. "Son, after tonight, I don't think you could be anything else. You've got something special, not just talent but heart, and that's what country music is really about." 1 year later, George stood in the same arena looking at a poster that featured Lucas's original drawing of him as Captain Country. The scholarship program had grown beyond his wildest dreams, supporting dozens of young musicians across the country, and Lucas, now 9 years old and considerably more confident, was backstage, preparing to open the show with a song he had written himself. The boy who had once been mistaken for a threat had become country music's brightest hope for the future. And George Strait, the king of country, had learned that sometimes the most important battles are won, not with weapons or strategies, but with the simple act of listening to the wisdom of a child who still believes in heroes. As the crowd began to chant his name once again, George smiled and adjusted his hat. Tonight, just like every night since that magical evening with Lucas, he wasn't just performing. He was carrying forward a tradition that would live on long after his own voice had faded, and that he realized was the most heroic thing of all.